A police officer notorious for his brutality and racial prejudice forcefully pulled an elderly black woman out of her car, accusing her of suspicious behavior. Without listening to any explanation, he acted rigidly and assertively, humiliating her in public view. But what he didn't expect, that woman was the city's newly appointed judge, a symbol of justice and courage, widely respected by many. When the truth came to light, the officer was not only struck by shock, but also faced severe consequences he could never have anticipated. This story doesn't just expose the abuse of power, but also sheds light on the deep-seated prejudices within society. More importantly, it delivers a powerful message. With determination and solidarity, we can break through the barriers of injustice and drive meaningful change. Before we dive into this compelling story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if stories about justice and courage inspire you, don't forget to hit subscribe to stay updated with more meaningful and impactful content. Morning. Gentle sunlight filtered through the trees, casting scattered rays on a small parking lot behind the neighborhood pharmacy. The air was quiet, filled only with the soft chirping of birds and the faint hum of engines in the distance. Mrs. Clarice Wilson, a highly respected black woman in the community, was carefully placing grocery bags into the trunk of her car. She had just completed a routine act of kindness, delivering food to an elderly, frail neighbor. As she was about to get into her car, the roaring sound of a police car engine broke the serene morning calm. A patrol car sped into the parking lot and screeched to a halt beside her old sedan. Officer Ryan Keller emerged, exuding authority and anger. He marched toward her with heavy steps, his hand gripping his belt as though ready to draw his gun. "Stay where you are. Put your hands where I can see them," Keller barked, his voice cold and dripping with malice. Startled, Mrs. Clarice froze, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Officer, is there a problem?" she asked calmly, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. Keller ignored her question, immediately grabbing her arm and pulling it harshly, causing her to stumble. "Don't play dumb. This area has had multiple break-ins, and this beat-up car of yours looks exactly like something a thief would use," Keller snapped, his tone filled with disdain and prejudice. Mrs. Clarice tried to remain composed, but indignation and anger swelled within her. She knew it wasn't the car or the neighborhood that made her a target. It was her skin color and the officer's deep-seated biases. Passers-by stopped to watch the bizarre scene. Some kept their distance, unwilling to intervene. A young mother, whom Mrs. Clarice had recently helped, quickly scooped up her child and left, her eyes filled with fear. No one spoke up. No one came to her defense. Their heavy silence seemed to affirm the injustice playing out before them. The atmosphere grew tense. Keller continued to yank at Mrs. Clarice's arm, treating her as if she were a criminal. Under his hostile glare, the rising tension filled the small parking lot, setting the stage for a gripping battle between justice and prejudice. The rough hand of Officer Ryan Keller tightened around Mrs. Clarice's wrist, but her eyes held no fear, only profound resilience. It was not merely the strength of a 65-year-old woman, but the will of someone who had dedicated her life to the fight for justice and human rights. Clarice Wilson was no stranger to the community. From children to the elderly, everyone knew her as a kind-hearted grandmother, always ready to lend a helping hand. She lived in a small house at the end of the street, always filled with the aroma of homemade baked goods. Whenever someone needed assistance, Clarice was the first to appear, bringing her warm smile and caring hands. But beneath her gentle exterior lay a long story of courage. More than 4 decades ago, Clarice had been a part of the civil rights movement in the southern United States. She marched in peaceful protests, faced oppression, and stood her ground in the fight for equality. She believed that everyone deserved to be treated fairly, regardless of skin color or background. This morning was no different. Before Officer Keller appeared, Clarice had stopped in the parking lot to help Emily Carter, a young mother struggling with a crying child. Emily, her eyes weary, seemed at a loss for how to soothe her baby. With the calmness of an experienced grandmother, Clarice stepped in. Within minutes, her gentle voice and kind gaze had calmed the child. "You're lucky to have such a wonderful little one," she said, handing back Emily's bag and patting the child's head. Emily smiled gratefully, her eyes reflecting deep appreciation. But that small moment of joy was quickly shattered by the roar of an engine and the arrival of the patrol car. Ryan Keller appeared, brimming with arrogance and prejudice, like a sudden blow to the morning's peace. Clarice, having just completed an act of kindness, was now being treated as a criminal. Painful memories of the injustices she had faced in her past suddenly resurfaced. Keller, with a cold, piercing gaze, required no evidence, no valid reason. An old car and a black woman were all he needed to make his judgment. But Clarice was not one to be easily intimidated. Amid the heavy silence of onlookers, she stood tall, her voice unwavering. "Officer, I don't know what you're looking for, but I have nothing to hide," she said, her tone calm yet resolute. Keller smirked disdainfully, a sneer full of contempt. "I'll be the judge of that," he replied, refusing to meet her eyes. To Keller, this was not a routine check, but an opportunity to assert his authority, regardless of the truth. The community around them remained silent. Emily, who had just been helped by Clarice, clutched her son's hand tightly, her eyes flickering between gratitude and fear. As for Clarice, though insulted, she maintained her dignity. She had faced worse in the past, and she knew the silence of the witnesses was part of the problem. But she also knew that this silence could not last forever. And she believed it would change, sooner or later. Mrs. Clarice stood tall, her eyes calm yet resolutely meeting the cold gaze of Officer Ryan Keller. Within him, not only was there a deep-seated arrogance, but also shadows of the past clouding his judgment. Keller was not a simple man. Years ago, he had experienced a tragic event that forever altered his life. His only younger brother, just 17 years old, was murdered during a robbery at a convenience store. The perpetrator, a young black man, was caught and convicted. But the memory of that fateful night weighed heavily on Keller's mind. Every time he closed his eyes, Keller saw his brother lying in a pool of blood, his eyes dim with pain. That image overlapped with the face of the perpetrator during the trial, a young man with hollow eyes. Those memories had entrenched themselves deeply into Keller's psyche, creating a chasm of prejudice that was not easily bridged. Yet, in fleeting moments, Keller felt an internal conflict. He remembered his mother, who had taught him never to judge others by their appearance. Images of innocent victims, like his brother, sometimes intertwined with the faces of those he labeled as suspects, leaving him to question whether he was imposing bias on those who didn't deserve it. But that question was always drowned out by pain and anger, trapping him in a cycle of suspicion and abuse of power. This had molded Ryan Keller into a rigid police officer who viewed everything through a lens of doubt. To him, not everyone was innocent until proven guilty. Instead, anyone he deemed suspicious was likely to be a criminal. He saw himself as a protector of justice, but in reality, he often abused his authority to reinforce personal biases. Beside Keller, his partner Sam Howard leaned against the patrol car. Sam was a young officer with little experience and was hesitant about Keller's behavior. He had witnessed Keller's rigidity and aggression in similar situations. However, Sam always chose silence, not out of agreement, but out of fear. He worried that speaking up would make him a target of Keller's ire or lead to isolation within the force. Sam cast a fleeting look of sympathy toward Mrs. Clarice, but quickly dropped his gaze. He lacked the courage to intervene and remained a reluctant bystander. Meanwhile, Keller persisted. His eyes swept over Mrs. Clarice's car with evident disdain. Pointing at her old sedan, he sneered. "This car is a total heap of junk. People usually use cars like this to haul stolen goods. What's in the trunk, old lady? Or are you just pretending to be a do-gooder to cover up something else?" Mrs. Clarice did not respond, but her unwavering gaze only fueled Keller's irritation. He leaned down, grabbing the car door handle, intending to open it without her permission. Sam spoke up, his voice low but firm. "Ryan, be careful. I don't think we should do this without a valid reason." Keller whipped around, his eyes as sharp as knives. "What did you say?" I'm doing my job. You just stand there and keep quiet. Sam lowered his head, saying no more. Within seconds, Keller turned back to the car, opened the door, and began rifling through it. His actions were brusque and disrespectful, seemingly knowing no bounds. Mrs. Clarice remained standing, her hands trembling slightly with anger. But her eyes continued to reflect her dignity and determination not to be diminished. Keller failed to see that his actions were exposing the cracks in his character. To him, this was just another day at work, a day where he believed he was protecting the community. But in truth, he was steering himself further down a path of no return. And Mrs. Clarice, despite being subjected to such unjust treatment, would be the one to make him confront the consequences of his misguided choices. Sam Howard stepped back, leaning slightly against the patrol car. His face bore a heavy expression, a mix of hesitation and helplessness, as he watched Ryan Keller escalate the situation. His eyes quickly glanced at Mrs. Clarice Wilson, an elderly woman who exuded rare composure. Though her heart pounded in her chest from the humiliation she was enduring, her back remained straight, and her eyes shone with steadfast determination. She was no stranger to injustice. Life had taught her its harsh lessons over the decades. Keller, his face cold and unyielding, made no effort to hide his disdain as he ransacked her car with aggressive motions. His rough fingers seemed intent on tearing through every layer of fabric, every compartment. The sharp sounds of objects being overturned and dragged echoed in the eerily quiet morning air. Finding nothing suspicious, his gaze shifted to a handbag on the passenger seat. "There it is," Keller said, his voice filled with smug satisfaction, as if he had discovered a prized treasure. He grabbed the bag carelessly, not bothering to ask permission. The crude gesture made Mrs. Clarice instinctively take half a step forward, a protective instinct rising within her. "Officer," she said, her tone calm but edged with sharpness, "that is my bag. You have no right to search it without a valid reason." Keller paused, turning his head to face her, his mouth curling into a contemptuous smirk. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" he snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. "Stand still and don't interfere with me doing my job." Anger surged within Mrs. Clarice, but she held it firmly in check. This was not the first time she had faced such insults, though it never made them easier to bear. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward again, her resolute gaze locking onto Keller's overbearing glare. "I've made myself clear," she said, her voice steady, but as sharp as a blade. "I have done nothing wrong and am willing to cooperate if necessary. But these actions are a blatant abuse of power." Keller appeared unfazed. Instead, he let out a derisive chuckle, a cold sound, like a predator's growl. "Your words mean nothing to me. A beat-up car like this, showing up in an area with recent thefts? Do you think I'm stupid enough to believe your story?" The baseless accusations hit like a blow to Mrs. Clarice's pride. But she refused to let her anger control her. She knew any outburst would only worsen the situation. "Officer," she said evenly, "I've already explained. I was helping a young mother here. This car has been mine for over 10 years, and I have nothing to hide. You are making a serious mistake." Keller had no intention of stopping. He yanked open the handbag, rummaging carelessly through its contents, scattering items onto the seat. Meanwhile, a small crowd had begun to gather, their anxious eyes fixed on the scene. Though none dared to speak up, Mrs. Clarice stood like a rock amidst the storm. She endured their prying gazes and baseless accusations, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, but her eyes remained alight with determination. "You're not only abusing your power, but also insulting my dignity," Mrs. Clarice said, her voice low and powerful. "If you find nothing wrong, I demand that you stop this immediately." This time, Keller's mocking grin faded. He stepped closer, reducing the distance between them to almost nothing. His heavy breath was hot and oppressive. "Do you want me to arrest you right here?" he growled. "Or do you want to find out what happens to stubborn people like you?" The atmosphere froze. Sam Howard, still on the sidelines, gripped his utility belt tightly. He knew things had gone too far. Yet, the courage to step in seemed to elude him. In Keller's eyes, Mrs. Clarice was not an innocent woman but the embodiment of defiance. For her, however, this was not merely a personal incident. It was a symbol of systemic injustice, a reality she could not ignore. Though hurt and humiliated, she vowed silently, "This fight is not over. The truth will prevail." Ryan Keller's menacing question hung in the stifling air, like a hammer striking the fragile patience of Mrs. Clarice. She stood there, alone in the parking lot, acutely aware of the curious yet cautious stares of those around her. The atmosphere was frozen, each person caught in a whirlpool of fear and helplessness. Some took steps back, their movements tentative, as if fearing that being too close might drag them into the storm's eye. Emily Carter, the young mother whom Mrs. Clarice had just helped, clutched her son tightly to her chest. Her arms trembled, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also panic. She wanted to say something, to do something, but fear silenced her resolve. Lacking the courage to stand up, she lowered her head, turned away, and walked off. Her steps were heavy, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. On the other side, through the pharmacy's glass windows, two employees peeked from behind the counter, whispering to each other, their eyes glued to the scene outside. Yet neither dared to open the door that separated them from the injustice unfolding before them. On the sidewalk, passers-by hurried along. Their eyes glanced briefly at Mrs. Clarice and Keller before quickly looking away, as though their mere presence might embroil them in trouble. Mrs. Clarice felt the profound isolation enveloping her. The collective silence of those around her was not only an expression of fear, but also a tacit verdict that she was not worth defending. Her heart ached. These people, this community she had so often helped, now turned their backs, standing on the sidelines as passive spectators to a tragic play in which she was the victim. Painful memories surged through her mind. Times she had faced injustice simply because of the color of her skin. But today's hurt was different, because it came not only from prejudice, but also from the silence of those she had supported. Ryan Keller, emboldened by the crowd's silence, grew even more arrogant. He stepped closer to Mrs. Clarice, his eyes gleaming with provocation. "See that?" Keller said, his voice low but cold as steel. "No one is standing up for you. They all know I'm right. They know you don't belong here." Those words cut deep, like a knife striking at the core of Mrs. Clarice's being. Yet instead of breaking her, they stoked a smoldering fire within. A fire of dignity and righteousness. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, searching for a single sympathetic glance, a tiny sign of solidarity. But all she saw were averted faces and evasive eyes. "Silence is not neutrality," she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying the weight of years spent fighting for justice. "Silence is complicity with injustice." Her words rang out like a bell, shattering the oppressive silence. A few people flinched, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. Emily Carter paused mid-step, seemingly stirred by something. But then she resumed walking, her head bowed, hiding her inner turmoil. The sense of betrayal washed over Mrs. Clarice like cold water. But it wasn't enough to extinguish the flames burning inside her. She turned back to face Keller, her gaze no longer one of pain or confusion, but the gaze of a warrior, someone long accustomed to standing against oppression. "You can't intimidate me, officer," she said, her voice steady and powerful, each word cutting through the air. "You can keep abusing your power, but I am not afraid. And I will not be silent." Her words struck at Keller's pride like a blow. The atmosphere around them shifted. A few glances in the crowd darted toward one another, a faint trace of guilt crossing some faces. Keller, though maintaining his cold exterior, showed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The tension remained thick. But Mrs. Clarice knew this was not the end. Even standing alone, she would not allow anyone, not even Ryan Keller, to overshadow truth and justice. She understood that in some way, what she was doing today would become part of the never-ending fight for a fairer world. Mrs. Clarice stood tall, her back straight and her shoulders unmoving, even as her heart churned like a raging storm. Keller's parting words, "No one is standing up for you," felt like a knife twisting deep into her memories, pulling forth a cascade of painful recollections. She had tried to push them away. But they never truly disappeared. They remained like scars, reminders that the fight against injustice had never truly ended. She remembered a rainy afternoon in her youth, back in the South. A sudden downpour had forced her to seek shelter in a small cafe. Rainwater dripped from her hair and clothes, but the coldness of the stares from those inside chilled her even more. No one said a word, but the icy, distancing looks spoke volumes. The staff ignored her, serving other customers as though she didn't exist. When she dared to sit at a table near the window, a middle-aged man approached her, his voice low but dripping with condescension. Those memories hadn't faded with time. As she grew into a strong woman, the experiences of being followed in upscale stores, being called demeaning names, or being ignored when seeking help from those meant to protect her continued to haunt her. Once, in a shoe store, she had caught the disdainful glance of a manager as she tried on a pair of shoes she knew she couldn't afford. But the most painful part wasn't the overt discrimination. It was the indifference of those around her. Just like today. Standing in the parking lot, Mrs. Clarice could feel the heavy silence of the community surrounding her. The very people she had once called neighbors, the ones she had helped countless times, now lowered their heads, walked away, or stood motionless like unfeeling statues. This isolation cut deeper than any insult Keller could hurl. But then, unexpectedly, there was a small movement in the silent crowd. Mr. Robert Davis, the local grocer from whom Mrs. Clarice had shopped for years, stepped forward. There was determination in his eyes, though the weight of the tension around him was palpable. "Officer Keller," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "I think you're going too far. This isn't how we treat someone like Mrs. Clarice." Keller spun around, his eyes darkening, his lips curling into a contemptuous smirk. "Robert, this doesn't concern you," he said coldly. "If you don't want trouble, I suggest you head back to your store." But Robert didn't back down. Though his hands trembled slightly, his voice remained steady. "Mrs. Clarice is part of this community. We know her, know how much she's done for everyone here, my family included. I can't stand by and pretend I don't see what's happening." The air seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on the two men facing off. Keller, his expression icy, merely shrugged, the faintest of sneers lingering on his lips. "I don't care who she's helped," he said, his words sharp as daggers. "I care about doing my job. If you want to vouch for her, prepare your papers and head to the station." Those words hit Robert like a blow. He hesitated, his eyes flickering between fear and courage. But Keller's domineering stance sent a clear message: any interference would be swiftly crushed. Mrs. Clarice looked at Robert, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Yet, she could also see the helplessness in his retreating steps as he turned back to the crowd. No one moved. No one stepped forward. The faint hope that had glimmered for a moment was quickly swallowed by the pervasive silence. But within her, the fire of defiance burned even brighter. She turned again to face Keller, her gaze now stripped of confusion or pain, replaced by the unwavering look of someone who had weathered too many battles to be afraid. "Do you think I'll break before you, officer?" she said, her voice low but cutting, every word a challenge. "You can threaten me, but I will not be silent. I'm not afraid of you, and I never will be afraid of anyone who abuses their power." The tension peaked. Mrs. Clarice's words rang through the heavy air, shattering the veil of apathy that had cloaked the scene. A few in the crowd stirred, their gazes shifting uneasily, a glimmer of guilt crossing their faces. Keller, though still outwardly composed, had a brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The tension remained thick. But Mrs. Clarice knew this fight was far from over. Yet, she no longer felt alone. Even a faint glimmer of hope was enough. She knew that truth and justice would eventually rise. And, as always, she would stand at the forefront, ready to face it all. As Robert Davis stepped back, the parking lot descended into a cold, oppressive silence. The air seemed to stop moving, filled only with the faint rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hum of everyday life. Mrs. Clarice stood motionless, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. But her heart felt like it was being crushed. The indifference and inaction of a community she had once trusted hurt more than anything else. Familiar faces now turned away, avoided her, or walked off as if they had never known her. Yet, deep inside, a small flame continued to burn, a flame that had kept her standing through decades of injustice and prejudice. And now it gave her the strength to face Keller, who was sinking further into his abuse of power. Suddenly, the soft but resolute sound of a door opening broke the suffocating tension. All eyes turned toward the pharmacy where Sarah Thompson, the pharmacist, stepped out. The middle-aged woman, her blonde hair tied neatly back and her white lab coat crisp, exuded a quiet determination in her stride and gaze. She had seen the entire incident through the window. And though anxiety gnawed at her, her sense of justice would not let her stand by any longer. "Officer Keller," Sarah called out, her voice ringing clearly, like a blade slicing through the oppressive air. "I think you need to stop and think carefully before continuing. I know Mrs. Clarice. She's not someone you can accuse without reason." Keller turned, his icy eyes glinting with mockery as they settled on Sarah. "Miss Thompson," he said, drawing out her name with deliberate sarcasm. "I don't think I need a pharmacist to tell me how to do my job." But Sarah didn't back down. She stepped forward, standing tall, her gaze steady and unwavering as it met Keller's. "Then listen to a member of this community," she replied, her voice calm but charged with conviction. "I've lived and worked here for 20 years. I know who can be trusted and who can't. And I know for a fact that Mrs. Clarice is not a criminal." Keller smirked, as though her words were no more than an amusing story. "You think you know more about the law than I do? How much do you know about investigations? About the dangers we face every day? If you don't want to ruin your day, I suggest you go back to your pill bottles." Still, Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes burned with unshakable resolve. "I'm not afraid of you, Officer Keller," she said firmly. "And I cannot stand by and do nothing while you insult an innocent person." Mrs. Clarice glanced at Sarah, a flicker of gratitude lighting her eyes. But Keller seemed unmoved. He stepped closer to Mrs. Clarice, his voice dripping with menace. "Do you think anyone can save you from this?" he said coldly. "What are you hiding?" Keller bent down, opening the trunk of Mrs. Clarice's car without asking for permission. As he rummaged through her belongings with rough and disrespectful motions, no one noticed that nearby, Emily Carter, the young mother Mrs. Clarice had helped earlier, had quietly taken out her phone. With trembling hands, Emily opened the camera and began recording. Recording the entire scene. Every word. Every gesture of Keller's. Every painful furrow of Mrs. Clarice's brow was captured. Emily didn't dare step forward to confront Keller directly. She understood the danger of challenging someone like him. But her gratitude toward Mrs. Clarice spurred her to do something she hadn't thought herself capable of. In her mind, Mrs. Clarice's words echoed. "Silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity with injustice." That phrase acted as a guiding light for her actions. The tension thickened. Sarah stood firm, an immovable figure against Keller's overreach. Mrs. Clarice, despite the indignity she endured, maintained her dignity and composure. Yet unbeknownst to most, Emily's quiet action was already beginning to shift the tide. As Keller continued rifling through the car, there was a slight stir among the crowd. Some began to whisper to one another, their gazes hesitant but searching. It seemed the determination of Sarah and the covert bravery of Emily had sparked thoughts they had not dared to face before. Somewhere within the community's seemingly unshakable silence, the seeds of resistance began to sprout. They were no longer entirely turning their backs on Mrs. Clarice. Though the shift was fragile, it signaled that something larger was on the horizon. And while Mrs. Clarice still stood alone for now, she was no longer truly isolated. The fire of justice had begun to spread. And in the end, the truth would not remain buried. Keller was rummaging through the trunk of Mrs. Clarice's car, his eyes filled with hostility as though determined to find something, anything, to justify his actions. Mrs. Clarice, though her hands were clenched in anger, maintained her composed demeanor. Sarah Thompson stood nearby, her eyes blazing with opposition, while Emily Carter continued to discreetly film from a distance. The atmosphere was heavy, like a ticking time bomb waiting for a single spark to ignite it. Suddenly, the sharp sound of confident footsteps echoed from afar. A man in a dark suit, exuding authority, emerged from the quietly observing crowd. His face was stern, his eyes immediately locking onto the scene of Keller bent over the car. "Ryan Keller," the man's voice rang out, powerful and unwavering. Keller and everyone else turned in shock. Keller straightened up, visibly unsettled by the man's unexpected arrival. "Who are you?" Keller demanded, his tone still carrying a hint of his usual arrogance, though tinged with unease. The man stepped closer, his piercing gaze fixed on Keller. "I'm Richard Lawson, the city's chief administrative officer. And this woman," he turned to Mrs. Clarice, his tone shifting to one of respect, "is Judge Clarice Wilson, recently appointed to the bench." Richard's words hit the parking lot like a lightning bolt. A suffocating silence blanketed the scene. The crowd exchanged stunned glances, struggling to process what they had just heard. Emily, still filming, held her breath, her hands trembling slightly as she steadied the camera. Mrs. Clarice said nothing, standing tall with a calm yet commanding presence. Keller, on the other hand, was visibly rattled. His face froze for a moment before he forced an awkward smile. "Judge Wilson," Keller stammered. I didn't know. If I had known, I would." "What would you have done?" Mrs. Clarice interrupted, her voice quiet but brimming with authority. "Treated me with respect only because of my title? Or would you have still treated me as someone without value, as you've done here?" Keller took a deep breath, attempting to regain control. "I was just doing my job, ma'am. This area has seen several thefts recently, and I thought." "What made you think I was a suspect?" Mrs. Clarice interrupted again, her tone sharper. "Was it my old car? My skin color? Or was it the assumption that someone like me couldn't possibly stand tall and demand respect?" Her voice resonated powerfully, not just addressing Keller, but asserting a message to the entire community. Richard Lawson gave a small nod, clearly in agreement. The crowd, initially silent, began murmuring. A few people bowed their heads, seemingly ashamed of their inaction. Keller tried to salvage the situation. "Ma'am, I apologize if I offended you. I didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Mrs. Clarice said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You didn't know who I was, yet you were ready to treat me as a suspect because of your prejudices. And if I weren't a judge, would you even be offering this apology?" Keller didn't respond. He stood silently, avoiding Mrs. Clarice's piercing gaze. Sarah Thompson, standing nearby, nodded slowly, emphasizing Mrs. Clarice's words. At that moment, Emily Carter, summoning newfound courage from her gratitude, stepped forward. "I recorded everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "Everyone will see how you treated Mrs. Clarice. And it's wrong. It's always wrong." Mrs. Clarice looked at Emily, her eyes filled with appreciation. Keller, now bereft of excuses, stepped back, his head lowered, his arrogance entirely stripped away. "Ryan Keller," Richard Lawson said, his tone losing its restraint. "I will be calling for a formal investigation into your conduct. Rest assured, this will be handled according to the law." As Keller retreated quietly, the atmosphere felt lighter. But Mrs. Clarice knew this was only the beginning. Justice wasn't just about confronting individuals like Keller. It was about transforming the system that allowed such behavior to thrive. With determination burning in her eyes, Mrs. Clarice resolved that her fight would not end there. The air in the parking lot settled after Richard Lawson declared an investigation into Keller. But Mrs. Clarice did not step back. She knew that silence now would mean letting the opportunity for change slip away. Her eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the familiar faces and their hesitant, averted gazes. Before turning back to Keller, he now stood with his head lowered, his once smug demeanor entirely gone. "Ryan Keller," she began, her voice carrying not just to him, but to everyone present. "You have not only insulted me as a person and a citizen, but you have also abused your power to demean someone you don't even know. What you've done today is not protecting the community. It is an act rooted in prejudice and arrogance. All eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Clarice as her words continued flowing through the parking lot like an unstoppable wave. You saw my car, an old one, and decided I could be nothing more than a suspect. You saw my skin and decided I don't belong here. You didn't need evidence. You only needed your prejudice. That is not justice. It is an unacceptable abuse of authority. She turned to face the crowd, her gaze landing on those who had initially stepped back. I am not speaking just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unjustly. For everyone who has ever been dismissed simply because they didn't fit someone else's expectations. Silence in the face of injustice does not make us innocent. It makes us complicit. Her words seemed to awaken something within the crowd. Emily Carter, clutching her phone tightly, her eyes darting nervously between anxiety and indignation, felt a stirring deep within. She knew that stepping forward would make her a target, that it might bring trouble. But the image of Mrs. Clarice standing tall, her gaze resolute, ignited something in Emily. She remembered the kindness Mrs. Clarice had shown her earlier that morning. A small gesture, but filled with compassion and care. That gratitude outweighed her fear. Taking a deep breath, Emily reminded herself that if she stayed silent now, her son would grow up in a world where silence meant complicity. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. Mrs. Clarice is right. I saw everything. I cannot stay silent while she's treated this way. I will testify if needed. Emily's eyes scanned the crowd. Sarah Thompson, the pharmacist who had been quietly observing, also felt a surge in courage. Though she wasn't accustomed to stepping up in tense situations, Emily's determination inspired her. Sarah recalled the times Mrs. Clarice had visited her pharmacy, bringing warmth and encouragement with her smile. While they weren't close, Sarah knew Mrs. Clarice had always been a positive force in the community. Taking a step forward, Sarah spoke, her voice strong and clear. I'll stand with you, Judge Wilson. What happened today isn't just wrong, it's a wake-up call. We can't let this continue. Emily and Sarah's bravery set off a chain reaction. An older man in the crowd, Robert Davis, who had initially stood still, now looked resolute. He remembered the times Mrs. Clarice had helped him with small issues in his store, never asking for anything in return. Stepping forward, his deep, steady voice rang out. So will I. Mrs. Clarice is an indispensable part of this community. If anyone should speak up, it's us. One by one, the crowd began to move. Each person stepping forward like pieces of a puzzle coming together. Voices of support echoed, growing from soft murmurs to a unified, resounding chorus. Fear gave way to courage, and hesitant glances became firm and determined. Robert Davis stood tall, his voice unwavering. I'll stand with you too, he said. Mrs. Clarice is integral to this community. If someone needs to speak up, it's us. Sarah Thompson nodded firmly. I'll stand with you, Judge Wilson. What happened today wasn't just wrong, it was a call to action. We can't let this happen again. The supportive voices spread through the crowd, creating an atmosphere of solidarity. Even Keller couldn't deny it. He stood there, frozen, his face betraying shame as he realized his authority was no longer a tool of dominance, but a weight of accountability he would have to bear. Mrs. Clarice looked around at the people surrounding her, her eyes filled with gratitude. She knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for herself, but for the entire community. A feeling of hope swelled within her. For at last, voices were being raised. Justice was no longer a distant dream, but something beginning to take shape. Born from the unity and courage of ordinary people. The community's support for Mrs. Clarice surged like a wave, dissipating the stifling silence that had previously enveloped the parking lot. Keller stood there, his face pale, as he tried to hold on to the remnants of his authority. Yet his empty gaze betrayed him. The arrogance that once defined him had vanished. Keller realized he had crossed a line he could never return from. Standing tall, her voice resonating with authority, Mrs. Clarice continued. I'm not merely asking for an apology, because an apology won't undo what happened. I will demand a formal investigation into your actions, Officer Keller, and the silent complicity of your partner, Officer Sam Howard. Her words rang out like a verdict, clear and resolute. Richard Lawson, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. "We will ensure that every misconduct today is brought to light," he added, his tone equally stern. Keller attempted to defend himself, his voice trembling with desperation. "Judge Wilson, I was following procedure. I didn't mean to offend." "What procedure?" Mrs. Clarice interrupted, her gaze sharp as a blade. "What procedure allows you to insult, humiliate, and abuse your authority based on personal prejudice? If you think I'll let this go easily, you are mistaken." Sam Howard, Keller's partner, remained silent, his head bowed. Though he hadn't directly participated in Keller's actions, his silence made it clear that he wasn't innocent. A few members of the crowd glanced at him with scrutiny, causing him to step back, visibly uneasy under the weight of their judgment. Keller, sensing the inevitability of his downfall, finally muttered a weak response. "I'll accept whatever decision my superiors make." Mrs. Clarice didn't take her eyes off him. "And your superiors, along with this community, will ensure that this injustice is not ignored. I will advocate for extensive reforms within the police force. Anyone who believes power gives them the right to impose prejudice will be held accountable." Her words were not merely a warning, but a clear commitment. Empowered by what they had just witnessed, the community began to show their support. Heads nodded in agreement, and murmurs of encouragement grew louder, leaving Keller with no escape. Keller stood still, silently acknowledging that his career might very well be over. He understood this wasn't just about an investigation. His reputation and authority were at stake, and the possibility of legal consequences loomed over him. Mrs. Clarice turned to the crowd one last time, her voice calm yet weighty. "Justice is not a gift granted from above. It is something we must fight for together to protect. And today we've done just that." Silence fell once more. But this time, it was not a silence of fear. It was one of respect and unity. Every eye was on Mrs. Clarice, recognizing that she was more than a woman standing up for justice. She was a symbol of a larger change, beginning at that very moment. But the story didn't end with Keller's downfall. In the aftermath, an independent investigation was launched to examine the entire conduct of the local police force. The investigation revealed that Keller wasn't alone. Many officers had allowed personal biases to influence their enforcement of the law. This led to sweeping reforms, including stricter oversight of police community interactions and mandatory training on equity and justice for all officers. The community began organizing public dialogues between police officers and residents. These meetings not only addressed long-standing misunderstandings, but also began rebuilding the fractured trust. Sarah Thompson, the pharmacist who had spoken up for Mrs. Clarice, volunteered to expand her pharmacy into a regular meeting space for community activities. The atmosphere in the parking lot gradually calmed after Mrs. Clarice's powerful declarations. Keller and Sam quietly walked away, shadows of men who knew they could no longer evade accountability. Yet, this event was not merely a conclusion to their actions or the start of an investigation. It sparked a wave of newfound awareness in the community. Initially silent and hesitant, the townspeople began to draw closer to one another. Whispered words turned into lively exchanges, and timid gazes were replaced by determined expressions. An elderly man, his voice filled with emotion, declared, "We can't let something like this happen again." Sarah Thompson, the pharmacist, grasped Mrs. Clarice's hand. "Judge Wilson, today you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for this entire community. We are grateful to you." Emily Carter, the young mother, approached with her child in her arms. "Thank you," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "Not just for what you did for me this morning, but for giving me the courage to stand up. I'll always remember that." Mrs. Clarice smiled gently, warmth spreading through her heart. But she knew these words of gratitude were only the beginning. True change requires action and sustained commitment. A few days later, Mrs. Clarice convened a community meeting at the town center. It wasn't an ordinary gathering. It was a historic moment where those who had once stayed silent came together to address an issue they could no longer ignore. Taking the stage, Mrs. Clarice scanned the crowded room, her eyes meeting the expectant faces of the townspeople. The incident in the parking lot was neither the first nor the last time we will confront injustice, she began, her voice resonating across the room. But today, we have an opportunity to create change, not just in how we treat one another, but in how our systems operate. She introduced a new initiative, a program focused on education about equity and justice. Its purpose was to train and raise awareness among both the community and law enforcement. The program included workshops, educational materials, and open dialogues to foster understanding and trust. This program won't be limited to the community, Mrs. Clarice explained. It will extend to the police force and all enforcement agencies in our city. We must dismantle prejudice, not only in individuals, but also within the systems that perpetuate it. Mrs. Clarice outlined the program, structured into 3 key phases. Phase 1. Open dialogue. Regular meetings between police officers and residents would be held at community centers. The goal was to create a mutual understanding of experiences, concerns, and aspirations. We cannot change unless we begin with understanding, she emphasized. Phase 2. Intensive training. A mandatory training program for all police officers in the city would be launched, collaborating with human rights experts and social organizations. The training would focus on identifying and eliminating biases in law enforcement practices. We will invite seasoned educators like Professor Linda Carter from the State University to lead sessions on the history of racial discrimination and peaceful conflict resolution, Mrs. Clarice explained. Phase 3. Monitoring and evaluation. Every 3 months, an independent committee of community representatives and law enforcement personnel would assess progress. The findings would be made public to ensure transparency. Mrs. Clarice scanned the room, her eyes filled with determination. Change will not come overnight. But with the commitment of all of us, it will come. Together, we will build a city where justice is not something anyone has to beg for, but something everyone inherently deserves. Richard Lawson, the city's chief administrative officer, stood to endorse the initiative. We need change, he said. And it begins right here, with this community. The attendees raised their hands, one by one, pledging to participate and support the program. Those commitments quickly turned into action. Sarah Thompson offered her pharmacy as a venue for open dialogues. Emily Carter and other young residents volunteered to create promotional materials for the initiative and share them on social media. Notably, Robert Davis, the local grocery store owner, pledged to sponsor workshops and cover the costs of guest speakers. "We've been silent for too long," he said. "It's time to do what's right for the next generation." Even Richard Lawson promised to propose additional funding to expand the program citywide. "We need to turn today's story into the foundation for a better future," he emphasized. Sarah Thompson volunteered to host meetings at her pharmacy, while Emily Carter committed to spreading awareness of the initiative on social platforms. Robert Davis even promised to provide free space at his store for community events. Mrs. Clarice left the meeting filled with hope. The parking lot incident, once a painful event, had become the catalyst for positive reform. For her, the most important thing wasn't the title of Judge Wilson, but the fact that she had inspired ordinary people to embrace the will to change. People who, like her, believed that justice wasn't a distant ideal, but a shared responsibility. That parking lot became more than a place where Mrs. Clarice stood her ground. It became the place where the community found its strength to unite. A small community had proven that injustice could not thrive when courageous individuals chose to stand together. The image of that day in the parking lot became a symbol of the town's transformation. A large mural was painted on the wall of the community center, depicting Mrs. Clarice standing tall, facing Keller with unwavering resolve. Behind her were familiar faces from the community: Emily Carter, Sarah Thompson, and Robert Davis. The mural bore the words, "Justice begins with courage." Each time they passed by, residents were reminded of the power of solidarity and steadfastness in the face of injustice. Mrs. Clarice's story was no longer just a memory. It was a driving force, inspiring them to continue their journey of change. A path they were ready to walk together. The community meeting concluded with resounding applause, accompanied by radiant expressions of belief and determination on the faces of the participants. Mrs. Clarice Wilson stepped out of the town center, where the sunset cast a soft amber glow over everything. The final rays of the day filtered through the trees, illuminating her serene yet resolute face. Her upright stance symbolized not just her resolve, but also the hope that had been ignited in the hearts of an entire community. As she walked, her steps seemed light. Yet her mind was filled with vivid memories of that day in the parking lot. The image of Keller, his face stiff and his eyes uneasy as his actions were exposed to the crowd. The image of Emily Carter, her hands trembling yet steady as she raised her phone to record the truth. And the image of Sarah Thompson, whose strong voice shattered the silence, alongside Robert Davis, who overcame his fear to do the right thing. These moments blended in her mind, forming a vibrant tapestry of courage and collective strength. That day, she realized that true power did not lie in titles, authority, or the loudest voice. It lay in the courage of ordinary people, willing to stand up for what is right. She had witnessed the transformation of a community that had once been mired in silence and fear. Small words and seemingly simple actions, when united by a shared purpose, had become a fire capable of breaking the chains of injustice. On her way home, each step felt buoyed by the sounds of life around her. The cheerful laughter of children echoed from a nearby park, mingling with the animated discussions of a group of adults, planning the changes they wanted to see in their community. Topics such as improving public spaces, protecting the rights of the vulnerable, and holding regular meetings to hear everyone's voices were eagerly debated. As she passed, some exchanged warm smiles with her, nodding in acknowledgement or offering kind greetings. These small gestures were signs that the events of that day had left an indelible mark on them. Mrs. Clarice recalled leaving the parking lot that day. Though weary and heartbroken, she knew that what she left behind was more than a story of justice served. It was a lesson in the power of courage, unity, and the belief that every action, no matter how small, could bring about change. Today, as she saw glimmers of hope in the eyes of her community, she knew the flame that she, Emily, Sarah, and Robert had kindled was spreading. It not only illuminated the dark corners of injustice, but also warmed the hearts of those who had once felt isolated and powerless. She smiled, her lips curving gently but meaningfully. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she also knew she was no longer walking it alone. The message of this story is clear. Injustice cannot survive when courage and solidarity are awakened. An individual can be a spark, but it is a collective determination that fuels a blaze, capable of breaking the chains of prejudice and oppression. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.